meeting that we've had, and today's session is on volunteers in sport. Thanks everyone for being able to make it today. Just a quick housekeeping around GoToMeeting. We do get some background noise if people don't mute their computer and their telephone. So if you're dialed in on the telephone, there's an opportunity here to click telephone and to put in your audio pin there. So you put a hash, then the number that shows there is your audio pin. That allows the coordinator here or the convener to actually mute you. If you want to mute yourself, you just go up here to your own button and click on that, and that should mute yourself there. And you will be able to see a list of who's in the room. And then down in this section here, you can actually use the chat room. So we do encourage you to ask questions as we go through. It's not always easy for everybody to use the microphone and chat. So we do encourage you to use the chat room down below there. If you've got any questions as we go along, put it in there. We've got a few gurus that have been involved with this technology for a while, so they can help out in the chat room as well. Now this morning we've got a couple of guest speakers. We're great to have Vanessa and Cecilia joining us. I won't talk too much about introducing them and allow them to introduce themselves, but it's certainly great to have them on board and to be able to present. I think Cecilia should be joining us shortly, and hopefully she doesn't have any problems getting on board as well. So I'm going to hand over the reins to Vanessa. We're just going to put up the volunteering website there so that we might be able to have a look at that as well. So over to you, Vanessa.
Great, thank you, and thanks very much for asking us to be part of this meeting and present on volunteering in sport. It's an area that I think historically Volunteering Victoria hasn't done a lot in, but being such a large sector that uses volunteers, then we're really keen to do as much as we can to help some of the sporting associations and clubs that are using volunteers. Our CEO, who's been here for about 18 months now, she used to be the CEO of Softball Australia, so she's got a great sporting background, and she understands some of the issues that we're seeing coming up in around volunteering in sport. So first I just wanted to give you a bit of background on Volunteering Victoria before I go through a bit about what we're doing in the sporting area. So we're the state peak body for volunteering. Our vision is resilient communities and empowered and active citizens through volunteering. We work with governments, local councils, local volunteer resource centres, community groups, and we have over 300 members that we work with in volunteering. So with all of those organisations, we are working on some priorities that we've come up with. Volunteering is so broad and so vast, and there's so many things that we could be doing, but we really need to focus on some key areas and see if we can make a difference in those areas. So one of our priorities is research, policy and advocacy. So some of the things we're doing around that, we have a research roundtable where we get together people who are involved in research to look at volunteering and to see what's going on in the volunteering arena in terms of research. We're putting out position statements on where Volunteering Victoria stands on a number of issues around volunteering. We've recently released our manifesto, which basically is a rundown of all the things that we stand for. We've also put in a budget submission to the government, which is where we think the government should be spending money on volunteering, and advocating for volunteering, and particularly volunteer management and volunteer managers. So we have an event coming up in 2 weeks' time, which is actually our National Volunteer Week event, and it's on advocacy. We've got some guest speakers coming along who have a background in advocacy, and it's really to give volunteer managers the skills and the tools to be able to advocate better for their programs and for their organisations and for volunteer management and what they do. We also run training and professional development programs. That's a big part of what we do as well. We have workshops on volunteer management, recruiting and retaining volunteers. We have corporate volunteering workshops. So there's a whole range of things we do there. Volunteer management. We have some events throughout the year, and we've also got a consulting service where we can send people out to individual organisations and consult with them on their volunteer programs. So some of the key areas of volunteering that we're focusing on, spontaneous emergency volunteering is a big one. We've recently received a grant to work on a pilot program around volunteer managers in spontaneous emergency situations, so volunteer managers getting them on the ground to be able to manage all the volunteers that turn up at an emergency situation. Multicultural volunteering, in particular asylum seeker and refugee volunteering as a means of social inclusion for them. Youth volunteering is a big one, and of course volunteering in sport is also a big area that we're working on at the moment. There's also volunteering is changing, and some of the areas that we're looking at that need a lot of promotion and help. Some of these new areas like virtual volunteering and micro-volunteering, which is happening online, skilled volunteering, and bite-sized volunteering projects. So this is an area where we feel like we can really help organisations to learn about how volunteers are changing and their expectations are changing and how they might be able to adopt some of these new volunteering methods to get volunteers into their organisation. Corporate volunteering is another area we're looking at, and that's half of my job. So we're working with companies who, for a lot of them now, it's becoming quite standard to give their staff volunteering leave, and often paid leave. So there's thousands and thousands of these employees who are all given a day or two to go and volunteer, and it's looking at how they can have the most successful program that they can have and how community groups can really utilise this resource. Often just one day for them is not what they need in their organisation. So for the organisations who can take these volunteers, we're looking at how they can scope out projects so that they can actually use this resource. And as I mentioned, volunteer management is a big part of the work that we're doing around advocating. We believe that the volunteer management underpins good volunteering, and it really should be supported better and resourced better. We've set up a special interest group for volunteer managers, and that's open to anybody who wants to be a part of it. We'd love to have some more sports-based organisations come and give their thoughts on volunteer management. We're also looking at developing a state awards program around volunteer programs and volunteer management, and that will have things, some of the awards will be an award for innovation, an award for thought leadership, so looking at sort of not so much for the volunteer, because there is a lot of award programs out there already for volunteers, but looking at volunteer management, volunteer programs. And lastly, Imagine the Possibilities, which is our marketing campaign that we've just rolled out. And if you can see the homepage there, just on the corner you can see the one of the posters that we've developed. The campaign that we came up with has been adopted by Volunteering Australia for National Volunteer Week. So that's going out nationally, which is great, and there's some fantastic imagery involved in that. We've had skilled volunteers be a part of this project, taking some amazing photographs, and the idea is to look at what our communities are like with volunteers and what our communities would be like without volunteers. We call it the utopia-dystopia theme. And those posters are able to be adapted for every community sector. We're having some developed for some particular community groups at the moment that we got some grant money. And we've got imagery for sport, we've got imagery for health, and this is going to be an ongoing campaign which any organisation will be able to access as it's rolled out gradually. So there's about 6.4 million volunteers in Australia at the moment, and 37% of those volunteer in sport and rec, which is a massive amount for one sector. And we feel like there isn't enough being done for volunteering in sport. An active volunteer workforce we think is absolutely critical to Australian sport and for it to continue successfully. Our work in sport is focusing on the volunteer management side. For us, volunteer management includes recruitment, retention, recognition, development of volunteer policies and procedures, roles and responsibilities, training volunteers, and then actually managing them on a day-to-day basis. And all of these things are in the volunteering national standards, which have been developed by Volunteering Australia. So it's really adopting those national standards to sport. Our CEO, Sue Noble, gave a talk at a volunteer expo last year, a sport expo last year, and there were about maybe 150 people in the room, and she asked the question of how many people had a dedicated volunteer manager in their organisations, and I think about 3 people put up their hands. So it's often a job that's tacked on to somebody else's role, and it's usually one of the committee members who's in charge of managing the volunteers. And it's such an important role for having successful volunteering that we really think that there should be a designated volunteer manager within those organisations, or somebody whose role it is to be aware of all of these responsibilities as part of the volunteer management. So one of the issues that we're seeing for sport and volunteering is what I mentioned earlier, that volunteers are evolving and changing, and volunteers are seeing the way that they want to be involved is changing as well. A really big diverse social, cultural, linguistic, religious backgrounds that are all wanting to be involved in volunteering. There's different generations now that have different motivations for wanting to be involved. People are seeing it more as a win-win, so they're doing something good, but they're also getting something out of it themselves, which we think is fantastic if that's the case. And it's often, work experience or some other sort of motivation. The understanding and experience of volunteering is changing. There's a lot more mobile and tech-savvy people who are able to volunteer now. A lot of it is done remotely. People are changing careers more often than they used to. So they have multiple roles, and they've got a vast array of experiences. And they're seeking to build social networks and connectedness through their volunteering. So one of the things that we'd like to do is to, I guess, make organisations aware of this changing nature of volunteering and how they can harness that and use it to recruit volunteers. As I mentioned also, we believe that excellent volunteer management is absolutely critical to having successful volunteering, and it's based on good traditional HR principles and practices. We like to talk about not as paid workforce and volunteer workforce, but just as your workforce, and that includes both. And volunteers and paid staff should all be treated the same. Now, there's a lot of resources out there for volunteer management, and there is information out there for volunteering in sport as well on a lot of different websites. Some of the local volunteer resource centres around the state have excellent information. As I mentioned, we provide information and training on our website, the Volunteering Australia website, there's Club Help, and I'm sure you know a lot more than I do about where you can find information. One of the things that we're working on at the moment is compiling all of the best information that's out there on volunteer management and volunteering in sport into the one place, and to make it easily accessible, so whether that's in bite-sized fact sheets or links that you can download information, things like that. So that's something that we've received funding to develop. It's really exciting, and these resources hopefully will be developed by the end of the year, and they'll be available for every sporting association to access. So hopefully that will help. Rather than having to go to different websites to look for information, we'll have the best of the information all in the one place. There's a number of different ways of recruiting volunteers as well, through the local volunteer resource services, which I hope people know about. I must admit I didn't know about them before I came to volunteer in Victoria, but there's probably 25 or 30 volunteer resource centres around the state. They're all run differently. Some of them are run through council, some of them are independent. And they are really the hands-on volunteer resource centres. They do the recruitment and matching. You can walk in there as a volunteer and be matched with a community organisation. So if you haven't connected with your local volunteer resource centre, then I strongly recommend that you do so. They will help you to connect with volunteers within your local area, and they're a really good resource to know about. Corporate volunteers are another source of volunteering. It depends what you need them for, but if you've got fundraising events or you need people to come and do a working bee or maintenance or things like that, corporate volunteers are excellent. And you can either contact companies yourselves, or you can contact us at Volunteer in Victoria or your local volunteer resource centres and put in a request for corporate volunteers. As I mentioned, it's becoming quite a standard thing for companies to send their staff out, and there are not enough projects for them. We often get calls from corporates looking for volunteers, looking for volunteer projects for their teams, and they can't find anything. So if you think that's something that you could use or that you could tell your clubs about, then that's a great source of volunteers. Skilled volunteers is another area that's really growing, and there's a number of great websites where you can advertise for skilled volunteers. And you're looking at things like a treasurer, someone with financial experience, or somebody to organise your fundraising day, or marketing your club, media people to put out some media releases. So there's anything that you think of that you don't have the resources to do yourself. The potential is there that a skilled volunteer could come in and do that. So Good Company is one organisation that advertises for skilled volunteers. Pro Bono Australia also advertise for skilled volunteers, and there's the Go Volunteer and Seek volunteer websites as well, and you can advertise on there. And that's just, I guess, thinking a little bit outside of sport. I think that's another area that we've found sporting associations tend to draw only from within their sport for volunteers. But for some of those skilled projects where the focus is on the role of reviewing the accounting systems rather than understanding the sport, you can potentially go outside of the sport, and there's a massive pool of volunteers there. So some of the things that Volunteering Victoria is doing, as I mentioned, we're developing the resources. We're also developing a training program which will follow on from those resources, and that will be for volunteer management specifically in sport. So we'll be adapting the programs that we're already running and making them relevant to sport. So there'll be more information about that coming up later in the year, and perhaps I can report back on some of those training and professional development programs. And a consulting service that we've got, and of course we'd always love people to come along to some of our general events on volunteering. So if anyone wants to be connected with Volunteering Victoria, then we would love to connect with you and grow
Volunteering Victoria's website.
And grow volunteering in sport in general. We can help with ideas for recruitment, the resources that we'll be developing, and networking between, not just between sports, but between volunteer involving organisations. And I think the way that this will grow is for everyone to get together and share their ideas and really talk about what some of the issues are that we can address. So yeah, thank you for having me, and stay tuned. I think this year is going to be a really exciting year for Volunteering Victoria, and hopefully we'll be able to stay in touch with what we're up to. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Vanessa. Does anyone have any quick questions for Vanessa before we move on? Paul's made a comment down there about the dispute settlement sessions.
Dispute Settlement Centre of Vic.
I think that was probably more a general question. We might come back to that one. Was there any other questions?
Yeah, David, it's Gene here. I just had a question which I typed in the chat room. Vanessa, how do we find out where our local volunteer resource centre is?
Oh, okay, yep. We've got it on our website, on the Volunteering Victoria website. There's a list of all the local volunteer resource centres, or you can give us a call and we can let you know where they are.
No worries. And so if we look on that website, Vanessa, we can get some list of resources and certainly get your contact details as well, should we want to follow you up.
Yep, absolutely. We have a monthly e-newsletter that goes out, which gives all the news of what's going on in the volunteering sector, and also all the things that we're working on, upcoming workshops and events, and whenever we've released something. So that's a really great way to stay in touch with what's happening, and any new information that we get on what we're doing in sport and what's happening in volunteering in sport will be in that newsletter. So if anybody wants to sign up for that, that would be fantastic, and you can do that via our website as well.
No worries. Well, thank you very much for your time, Vanessa. You're welcome to stay on board, and we'll have some general discussion after we hear from Cecilia, and we can maybe come back to some of those topics as well. So I'm just going to hand over the controls to Cecilia, and hopefully she's there now and ready to go.
I am. How are you going this morning?
Great, thanks. And look, everyone's probably going to put some questions for you in the chat room on the side there. So if you need to, we can keep an eye on that as well.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. David, did you give me an intro before? Do I need to?
I haven't told too much about yourself, so if you want to do that intro, that'd be fantastic.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. My name's Cecilia Hamana. I'm the Director of the National Sport Research Program here at the Australian Sports Commission. I'm delighted to be here with you this morning and to share with you some of the early insights out of the volunteer market segmentation research that the ASC commissioned about 7 or 8 months ago. We're nearly about to launch and release the volunteer segmentation. So what I thought I'd do this morning is just take you through a bit of a background about where the segmentation research kind of evolved from and how we've built on that over time, and then talk to you specifically about the volunteer segmentation itself. So as we go through, do feel free to throw out any questions and I'll be happy to try and respond to those. So originally, I think the volunteer segmentation really has evolved from a body of work that we did around the market segmentation for sport participation. Now, you may or may not be aware of this, the work that we've done in this space over the last 2 years, and it really evolved out of our need to gain an in-depth understanding of the entire consumer marketplace and really thinking about the demand for sport itself and how does that compete with the other leisure activities that our community are deciding to purchase instead. Now, we know the community has changed and has shifted over time, and the range of leisure activities that they are able to access has changed quite dramatically over the last 10 and 20 years. So we set out to try and develop a market segmentation model that very much mirrored the approach undertaken by a lot of commercial companies who are trying to capture that share of wallet from the community around how they purchase their leisure activities. So primarily, that original piece of work sought to try and uncover and explore those primary motivations and barriers and attitudes towards, firstly, club sport participation and how it compared with the full range of other activities and sports that people can play, and how it, sorry, I'll just take that off my screen, and how it directly impacted on their behaviour towards playing sport within a club environment or not. Now, we released the market segmentation for sports participation in 2012, and it's all of the material is available on the Clearinghouse. So I've put up the link there in case any of you haven't seen it before and are interested in going to it. And I'll just show it up here in terms of what that market segmentation looked like. So this really mapped out for us the entire marketplace. So any of those people who are involved in physical activity and who are purchasing or are doing some type of sport or physical activity through a social unpaid way. And the idea behind this was to really understand who are the segments within this consumer marketplace, what's the size of the segment, and then what do we actually need to understand to try and deliver a product that is going to meet their needs. Now, the reason why I show this up for you is because it really was the catalyst for us to, I'll take you back to the first slide, to really understand what it means for the supply side of our delivery sport chain. So, and in this respect, very much thinking around the volunteer workforce, which is very much the heartland and the basis of sports delivery. So we did two things following that market segmentation. We've added parents, which we will release soon, and this is around really understanding how parents are the key influences, or one of the key influences, in the types of activities that their children participated, and how does that relate to sport. So this was an overlay of that main market segmentation study. And then in 2013, so last year, we embarked on another segmentation study, which is essentially to understand who are the consumers and the players within the Australian community. And this research really tried to uncover what does the volunteer workforce for sport look like? Who are they? How do they engage in their volunteer behaviour towards sport? And what are they looking for in terms of opportunities to volunteer? So what we ended up doing then in 2013, we embarked on this research to really start uncovering the whole supply side when it came to the volunteer workforce. We know in 2010 that over a third of the Australian population take part in some type of volunteer activity. Now, sport has the largest proportion of volunteers, with about 14% of the adult population claiming to volunteer in sport. And when we embarked on this research, and much of this is already well documented, you know, one of the things about the volunteer segmentation that we developed didn't uncover necessarily anything startlingly new, but what it did do was it reconfirmed it, and it framed it in a way that hopefully people can understand and use to help inform the way that they manage their own sport volunteer workforce. So we know when we looked at all of the evidence around volunteering that obviously the reliance on volunteers is very much a risk for the sports sector, as it is with other sectors. We know that people are increasingly time poor, and we know that there is a huge demand for that volunteer time. And we also know that the landscape within Australia is changing quite dramatically. We've got cultural diversity, we've got changing generational dynamics and attitudes, and all of this is having an impact on the volunteer culture. And we were very interested in understanding how it impacted specifically on sport, and what does sport need to understand to try and develop very targeted and hopefully effective volunteer recruitment and retention strategies, because our sport volunteer is a very different beast to the rest of the volunteer marketplace. So we asked ourselves again when we went through this piece of work and we looked at the first market segmentation that we did, why should we do a market segmentation? And I'll just take you through some of the basics in case some of you aren't familiar with the terms market segmentation or segmenting. We didn't do the segmentation based on demographics, so we didn't segment on age or gender or where they lived. What we know from a commercial perspective, and what works very well in the commercial environment that translates over to the social environment, is that people do not make decisions and their behaviours are not influenced by their age necessarily or by their gender, but really by their core motivational needs and desires. And this is what we tried to unpack, not only for our market segmentation for sport, but also around volunteers. So a segmentation really divides your marketplace or your community into a group of people where you can really understand their needs, their attitudes and their behaviours, and there are similarities around that. So again, the key is around their needs, their attitudes and their behaviours. It's not about whether they're male or female, old or young. Okay, so it's very much going back to their core emotive drivers. And the idea around the segmentation was to really help sports and clubs work out where their best bang for their buck was going to be around volunteers. So if they, and we all know that sports have very limited resources, and it differs across the whole sporting landscape, and clubs themselves are very under-resourced in many respects and lack the capacity and the resources to really invest as heavily in this space as some of the other organisations that they're competing with. And the idea is to be able to, with a thorough understanding of your volunteer marketplace, to understand how to target your approach when it comes to your communications, when it comes to delivering opportunities for people to volunteer, and when it comes to the types of services and support that you might provide your volunteers. And this then leads us to being able to better align or allocate the scarce resources that we do have to either activities that try and retain your volunteers or activities to try and acquire new volunteers. So for us, the purpose behind the segmentation is really about helping sport keep the people that you have and to acquire new people where you have the greatest opportunity to do so. So this segmentation hopefully will offer sports the opportunity to understand your volunteer base. So this is your existing volunteer base and how to retain them. It will help you understand how you can acquire or recruit new volunteers by understanding those segments that have the largest opportunity for you to enrol in your organisation and volunteer. And this helps you really focus those resources. So you don't want to undertake a whole range of activities or communications or resourcing towards individuals who have no intent and are very difficult to shift towards volunteering in a sport organisation. And so, thirdly, I guess it's to try and uncover some of those opportunities for broadening your volunteer base by offering different ways or products is not the quite right word, but the opportunities to attract some of those segments who might not ever have considered volunteering in sport. So for us then, I guess, unfortunately I can't show you the volunteer segmentation at this point. We are about to launch it, so what I wanted to do was just to give you a bit of a taster. What we did identify, if you recall, the market segmentation for sport participation, it looks very similar to that in terms of the framework and the way that it's presented. What we found is that there were 10 segments within the volunteer marketplace, and we looked at the entire volunteer marketplace. So we looked at those who might volunteer for Red Cross or Save the Children or for their local Salvation Army, right through to those who specifically volunteer their time within the sporting space. So those who give up their time to volunteer within a club environment. And we also included those people who have no intention to volunteer so that we could identify how large that segment was within the population. And what we found is that there were 10 segments, of which there are some where there is real potential for sports to acquire them into the club or the broader sport environment. We identified segments which have a priority for retention, and these are the ones who look like they're likely to lapse or to cease their volunteer behaviour. And we also identified those segments which have very low priority for sport in terms of trying to acquire their involvement in becoming a volunteer in sport. And so, this group of segments we wouldn't even bother wasting our resources on because they're very hard to shift. Now, one of the interesting things, and a couple of highlights that I can share with you from the main findings from the volunteer segmentation, is that volunteering in sport was seen to be, wasn't seen to be really volunteering in the truest altruistic sense when you compared it to other types of what they called welfare volunteering. And that's quite an interesting finding when you think about what does volunteering mean. When we posed that question to the community, sport came out and was perceived to be quite different. So those who were volunteering and even those who weren't volunteering in sport, there needed to be a direct relationship to a particular sports club. So in this respect, they tended to differ to the rest of the altruistic volunteer market. And volunteering behaviour itself really reflected the life stage that the individual was in, and this was particularly evident for sports themselves. And so a lot of this very much is around providing sports an insight into the volunteer psyche and the volunteer behaviour and their attitudes. So the volunteer segmentation itself really represents the voice of the community. What it hasn't done And this is where we're at the start of this piece of work. But what it hasn't done is then reflect back onto what does this actually mean for sport themselves within the constraints of resources and capabilities that they have, and also all of the requirements that are put on all volunteer organisations, both at a Commonwealth and a state and at a local level, around regulations, legislation, public liability, insurances, etc., around how to maintain a volunteer workforce. So one of the first things I would say is that this piece of research is all about understanding the voice of the volunteer, who the volunteers are, what are they looking for, what do they need. The biggest challenge for all of us is then to understand how can we deliver to that with all of the constraints that we have. So in terms of where to next for us, the research itself, the segmentation, will be released hopefully in June, and then we'll start working on understanding how best sports will be able to try and use some of these insights into how they try and deliver experiences and maintain their sporting clubs around this whole kind of volunteer workforce. But again, if I could just reiterate, this is about understanding how the community views volunteering in sport and volunteering generally. What do they want to get out of volunteering? What are they looking for? What turns them off from volunteering broadly and more specifically in sport? And if they choose to volunteer within sport, what are they actually looking for? So what are their expectations? What are their needs? How can sports service that if they want to retain them within their workforce? So I feel like I've just kind of done a massive barrage there. So I'd be open to any questions or comments that you have. And I do apologise that I can't show you the mainstay of the research, but hopefully it's enough of a taster to get you interested to go and look at that segmentation when it becomes public.
Thanks very much, Cecilia. Dean had a question there in the chat room that he put about compulsory volunteering. Do you touch on that at all? And that's, I guess that's the term that we've thrown around a little bit around where members are made to volunteer, whether they're young people, they're the children are playing for the club, and they have to do their bit, whether it be in the canteen or marking lines or etc.
Yeah, look, that came up time and time again, and this is where I raised the point before. You'll see where sport volunteering was seen to be very different to the kind of altruistic volunteering. So within the kind of sport volunteering space, there was a view that you volunteer because you have a direct relationship or a direct connection with a sporting club. Now that's either through yourself currently as a player, whether it's historically you previously were a player, or it's because you've got children or grandchildren who are currently playing within that sporting club. It was quite interesting when we spoke to parents, and we spoke to the full gamut of volunteers, ranging from teenagers, because we know teens often are volunteering in some capacity, right up to grandparents, so right across the age spectrum. And we found that when we spoke to parents in particular, their views were quite varied. So there were many parents who believed it was, in fact, their responsibility to contribute back to the club because it enabled their child to play. Another interesting finding came through where parents said that although they wouldn't necessarily volunteer their time, if someone came up and tapped them on the shoulder, 9 times out of 10 they would have felt compelled. Now whether that was out of guilt, out of embarrassment or out of obligation, they felt they would be compelled to say yes. Now they talk about looking for a short and fast engagement, those types of parents. So if you tell me what to do, how to do it and where to be, and if you say it's only going to be an hour, it's an hour, it's not, the whole day, then most parents said they would willingly do that.
Thanks, Cecilia. There was also one there about training and whether training for some of those roles is a barrier to being involved as well. Brenton's put something there about specifically access for all abilities, but I think it ranges to all roles where we need to be trained to what we need to do.
Well, I think one of the things that came through strongly time and time again amongst all of our discussions with the community. There are different types of volunteering that occur within a sporting club or a sporting environment, ranging from those that require training, so whether that's coaching or officiating, right through to being able to man the sidelines with a flag or to take scores if it's for netball or for basketball. And these things had differing levels of training required. One of the things that was really clear was that some clubs, some sports, manage those differences really well. And so you had some examples where training for coaching, for instance, was very well organised, was free or low cost, and it was well communicated to the individuals as to how they would do it, how long it would take them, right through to the examples where people turned up and they didn't have a clue as to what was required, where they needed to go, what they had to do, was there a cost. And so organisation, or the lack of organisation around all elements of volunteering, was one of the biggest stumbling blocks for people attempting to volunteer and for staying as a volunteer. Most people, though, who recognised and were willing to volunteer their time also were open to being trained. It was how well that training was delivered was the biggest stumbling block. Just going through the questions here, Darren, David.
Yep, the last one there was from Mark. Paul's also got a question in there about when will it be launched and how will it be launched to the national sports organisations as well?
Yeah, look, we're hoping to be able to do a bit of a roadshow to all of the NSOs, and where appropriate to present it out to the SSOs and the SSAs as well at the different forums. And so, and also to hold workshops as well. We'll have a range of resources that will be available through the Clearinghouse on the Australian Sports Commission website. And so there'll be lots of summary information, what we call segment portraits or segment profiles. And this is where it provides you with a clear understanding about who each segment is, so what types of people does it make up, what are their primary needs, what are their primary issues in volunteering, so what are the stumbling blocks for them to volunteer in the first place, and what are the things that are pushing them away from volunteering. And then what's the best way to try and communicate to this particular segment. So we'll be looking to having a range of online material as well as running presentations and workshops in each state and territory.
Thanks, Cecilia. And the last one there I'll just touch on from Mark was about the overemphasising accreditation and responsibilities for, I guess, committee members and volunteers. And is it possible to ever roll back that administration in sport?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, the research itself, when we're talking about how it affects volunteers, it's a difficult question to ask. I don't think I'll be able to answer it, but I can unpack it a little bit maybe from the research itself. So the requirements for volunteers, if they're quite heavy, clearly they were a barrier to people wanting to give up their time. And remembering that within the volunteer space, there are lots of different volunteers who volunteer for different purposes. So we had the altruistic group who were giving their time and felt they needed to be attached or were giving to a cause that was close to their heart. There were the experimental volunteers who were looking for something to do. They wanted to volunteer. They weren't quite sure what they wanted to do, but they wanted to give their time and share their knowledge. And then we had another group of volunteers who were very much about self-benefit. So these guys were volunteering to get something out of it for themselves or for their family. And our sports volunteers sit in the latter two categories. Now we know for those who are volunteering, if there are requirements for them to be accredited or registered, then the process in which they have to undergo that has to be very well organised. It needs to be very clear. It has to be simple where possible. And if we can remove some of the red tape, it would make it much more appealing to them. Now, of course, none of this is new to all of us. We all know that these are issues for volunteers. But what we can tell you is specifically what are the issues for particular segments. So I don't think I've quite answered that question. We are actually doing some research at the moment around accreditation for coaches. And we know from that bit of work that accreditation for many people is a major stumbling block. And that's not because they don't believe that it's of value necessarily, but the process in which they have to undergo to go through it is protracted, it's difficult, it's disorganised, and sometimes it's costly.
No worries. Thanks very much, Cecilia, for your time. It's been great to have you on board, and we certainly look forward to seeing that research be presented and to come out. I certainly know that what you've already done has been really helpful, and from an active after-school point of view, look forward to the parents' component of that as well.
Yep, no problem at all, David. And look, if anyone wants to follow up with me afterwards, I'm very happy for you to give them my contact details. And I just want to thank everyone for your time today and letting me share with you some of the pre-launch information for our volunteer segmentation.
Thanks very much, Cecilia. I'm going to unmute the room now, and everyone can have a bit of a chat and see whether we've got anything that we want to talk about there and that's come out of that discussion. So if anyone wants to fire out, someone might have best practice they'd like to share as well.
Is Cecilia still there?
Sorry, I was just about to hang up, but I'm happy to stay on.
It's Vanessa from Volunteering Victoria. I just had a quick question.
Sure.
I was just wondering if the segmentation that you've done, is it, I'm just wondering the different roles that you mentioned within a club, the different volunteer roles. I think what we found is, you know, the difference between volunteering as a coach compared with being on the committee. You know, there's different types of volunteers will volunteer for different roles, and whether the segmentation had addressed those different roles within a sporting club. And I just was thinking, because some research that we've seen on skilled volunteering in particular shows that the main motivation for them is the skills match. So them being able to do a professional job of their volunteering
Yes.
rather than what the organisation is specifically.
Yes.
So I was just wondering, yeah, whether the segmentation addressed some of those different motivations according to the roles.
Yes, and look, sometimes motivation, I think what you're saying is very true, but sometimes the skills, sometimes it wasn't about the necessarily skills to motivation or motivations around the skills. So it varied, that sounded a bit confusing, but it really depended. So the way our study approached it was to firstly look at the motivations to become a volunteer in the first place. So what is it that drives people to volunteer their time, the whole volunteer space, then look at it specifically from a sports perspective, and then to look at it from within a sport, well, what are they actually looking for? And sometimes that reflected upon the types of roles that they were involved in. So yes, there were some segments were much more about being able to use the skills they have directly in the role that they would be volunteering in. And there was also an element around that about wanting to feel that their professional skills were used to the best of their ability, but also to the advantage of the organisation they were volunteering for, and also for some a desire to pass on that skill and knowledge over to other individuals, particularly those who are in their later working years. So, you know, those demographically who are typically in their 50s and 60s and 70s. But also, what we found is that across the many different roles that people can volunteer their time in, there's a different level of engagement and management that was required for the different types of roles, right? So from being an official, from a coach, right through to being the person who cooked the sausage at the sausage sizzle. And all of those things, they were very clear about the type of engagement and the type of management that they were looking for them to be able to feel comfortable and confident, but also valued in that role.
Thank you.
Any other comments? I know we're getting close to the end of our hour. Is there any other comments on volunteering or information that we'd like to go forward with this? Everyone's gone quiet. I think I've unmuted everyone. The other comment is hopefully people have found this very valuable, and we might get an email out to people just to allow for some feedback on the session. And I guess this is our second session of online meetings, so it might be worthwhile to get some feedback on whether people feel this is a positive way forward.
All right, thanks again, everyone, very much for your time. I appreciate being able to share this with you. And just apologetic, I can't show you the whole segmentation at this point.
Not a problem at all. We appreciate the time, and we certainly, through both ourselves and Gippsland, who are partners in presenting this, we can get that information out through newsletters and things like that as well. So appreciate the time, Cecilia.
Okay,
and thanks also to Vanessa.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, and we might leave it there if no one else has got any comments or questions, and yeah, we'll certainly continue some communication via email.